Oh, it feels good to be back. Yes, I know it's been a while since my last video and I am really sorry about that. I've been really itching to make more videos recently. However, today we're back in the office with a brand new video. If you're like I was and you read the information or the specifications of a camera, you look at the sensor information, for instance, and you just think, what the f? Or you wondered why a shot looked different on one camera than it does to another, even though you're using the same lens, then this is what that video is for. So in this video, we're going to be discussing a topic that took me ages to understand. When I was first learning about filmmaking and photography, and I'd hear about other people talking about crop factor, whereas now I'm in a position where I know a lot more about it, I understand what it means, and so that's why I want to share this information for those who are still struggling to get their heads around it. Crop factor is an extremely important factor for you to consider when it comes to choosing the right camera for you, as your camera's crop factor is determined by the sensor that camera has. And those different sensors have the power to influence your camera's depth of field, your low light ability, and the crop factor. So first of all, let's quickly run through some of the most popular sensor types that you would find in cameras for filmmaking. You have full frame, Super 35, APS-C, and even Micro Four Thirds. There are others such as 1 inch or 2/3 of an inch sensors. However, these are more common in cameras for journalism or even drones. We're not going to be talking about those particular sensors in this video. However, it is worth knowing that other sensor sizes do exist. Back to the main three that we're going to be discussing in this video. To show this in the most effective and visual way, I managed to get a good looking chap to sit in as a model for us, and really simply created a mock interview setup, and he sat in for us as the interviewee. As a heads up, I only relied on natural light for these examples because at the time my Godox light decided to break on me, that some of you might have seen in a previous video. Charging too little can be dangerous and it can cause... what's going on there? Which reminds me that, where is it? This arrived today. It's the Aputure 120D Mark II. I'm not using it for this video yet because I've not got the light dome to go on the front of it. If anyone else watching has this light, does your Bowens mount have a little... It's a bit loose, whereas the Godox wasn't, so I'm just a little bit... I managed to get my hands on 3 different cameras to show you visually how the different sensor sizes influence the crop factor. The cameras that I used were the Panasonic Lumix S1, which has a full frame sensor, the Panasonic EVA1, which is a higher end Super 35 sensor camera, and the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema 4K, which has a Micro Four Thirds sensor. So let's have a look at all 3 shots on screen at the same time. There are clearly some differences here, with some more zoomed in than others. These were all shot at the same focal length on the lens. They're all shot at 30mm. And this is where we start to see where crop factor has an effect. Crop factor is a ratio that is compared against 35mm film or a full frame sensor. So for the Lumix S1, a crop factor doesn't exist because that has a full frame sensor. Therefore, when I'm shooting at 30mm on the Lumix S1, I'm getting a 30mm focal equivalent. For any sensor that is smaller in size than a full frame sensor, there will always be a crop factor present. If this is starting to get a little bit confusing, let's see how this visually works. So here we have the Panasonic EVA1, and even though that was shot at 30mm, it is still more zoomed in. That's because the EVA1 has a Super 35 sensor, and that results in a crop of around 1.4 or 1.39 to be precise. So this is essentially like taking your full frame footage and scaling it in by 140% or 139%. In fact, let's pop it next to the EVA footage and see how it matches. There we go. So now those two look similar. They are slightly in different positions. However, in terms of what you can see in the frame, it's looking a lot more similar. And finally, let's go back again to the Blackmagic footage, which is also shot at 30mm, but on a Micro Four Thirds sensor. So again, that is even more scaled in than the Super 35 sensor. And that's because the Micro Four Thirds sensor has a crop of 2. So rather than the 1.4 crop with the Super 35, Micro Four Thirds has a 2 times crop. So again, for comparison, if we scale the S1 footage in by 200%, there we go. It's again looking quite similar. So depending on the sensor size of your camera, you need to consider the crop factor that lens paired with the camera will provide you. As a random example, A lot of people shooting real estate videos tend to shoot with a 16 to 35mm lens, or a 16 to 35mm equivalent. 16mm on a full frame sensor is really wide. However, if you shot at 16mm on the Blackmagic 4K camera, which is a Micro Four Thirds sensor, it's going to be way tighter, and that is due to the crop. Essentially what you're doing is you're taking that 16mm focal length, timesing that by the crop factor that the sensor gives, that results in 32mm. This doesn't mean that you wouldn't ever be able to shoot a wide angle shot on a Micro Four Thirds camera or a Super 35 camera or sensor. Instead, lens manufacturers are producing lenses with the crop factor already in mind. For instance, this is a lens that's designed for usage on a Micro Four Thirds sensor. This is the 12 to 40mm f2.8 lens by Olympus. And if at this point you're already getting the hang of how crop factors work, this results in a full frame equivalent view of 24 to 80mm, because you're multiplying the 12 to 40 by 2. So 12 times 2 is 24, and 40mm times 2 is 80. Again, as another example, the Sigma 18 to 35 is designed for APS-C size sensors. So this wouldn't necessarily work on a full frame sensor. It can, but you'll have a lot of vignetting. However, with an 18 to 35 focal length on the lens, then considering the crop factor of an APS-C sensor, this results in something like a 29 to, I believe, 58mm equivalent. 56mm. Good old calculator. Now, one final thing which is extremely important to know is that a lens designed for Micro Four Thirds cameras and Micro Four Thirds sensors won't work on a camera with a full frame sensor inside of it. If you can't afford the 16 to 35mm f2.8 lens by Canon, for example, don't assume that a 12mm to 40mm would be even wider. Because this lens is made for a particular type of sensor and coverage, the crop factor is already considered in here. So this knows that your field of view will be 24mm. And because this lens is designed for Micro Four Thirds sensors, the back element is actually extremely smaller than you would find on a full frame lens. So even if it was physically possible to attach this lens onto a full frame camera, it's just going to look shite. Considering crop factor can be very complex and extremely mathematical at times, especially when you're first getting used to working out what crop factor does to your camera. It took me donkey's years to understand, but I promise that once you do get the hang of it and you start to understand the math behind crop factor, it will help you in the long run, because you'll already be aware of the focal length equivalents that lens will be producing, rather than buying one, sticking it on your camera and thinking, whoa, that's tighter than I thought a 50mm lens would give you. If you found this video helpful, and hopefully it's not been too long, please like it, please subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet. And also, if there's another area of photography or filmmaking that you'd like me to explain in more detail, leave it in the comments below and I will take a look. So in the meantime, as always, take care and I will see you very soon.